Welcome to Obsession Engineering. I'm going to ask you an important question. Are you ready for winter? And when I say that, I kind of really mean, is your bike ready for winter? Well, if not, stay tuned and we'll show you how to get it ready. Most of this video I'm going to be concentrating on how to prep a track bike or a race bike to sit over winter. But some of the things I'm going to do will be relevant to a road bike as well, and we are going to touch on things you need to know if you're going to ride your road bike through winter, which of course you should do because you're not some sort of namby-pamby. First things first though, if you're going to be heading into your workshop or your garage or your shed, you might be a little bit cold out there, so you need to get onto the Obsession Engineering website, nip onto the shop and buy yourself an Obsession Engineering bobble hat, because they are immensely warm and they will keep both your brain cells lovely and toasty. And while you're there, you can treat yourself to a t-shirt or a hoodie or any of the other wonderful merch that's available. The first sensible thing we're going to talk about is relevant to road and track, and it is tyres. So whether your track bike is going to be sitting all winter or whether your road bike is going to be getting used through winter, there is something relatively important to do with tyres. Tyres lose pressure over time. They just do. There's not a lot we can do about it. On the road, that is incredibly critical because in the wet and the cold, your tyres need to work absolutely perfectly to the best of their capabilities. Obviously, you're not allowed a set of racing wet on your road bike, but you can have a more winter biased tyre, like a Michelin Pilot 6 or something like that, a particular road tyre that is designed to work in the cold and the damp. Once you have selected a sensible tyre, you will of course need to run it at the correct pressures. In the wet and in the cold, never have your pressures too low. In effect, if you have the tyre too soft, especially with the front, when you brake, the tyre deforms and it actually closes up the gaps in the tread, and therefore you basically end up with a slick, and that's not going to be very good at moving water. So you want to be on the manufacturer's recommended settings for your tyres. It seems sensible, it seems obvious, but it's so easy to forget to do your tyre pressures. And obviously, if you've set them when it was surprisingly warm a few weeks ago, now they will probably be under pressure. Sensible head done, onto the race bike stuff. The rear of your bike is probably going to spend all winter sat on a paddock stand. The front will probably spend all winter sat on the floor. Now that's not really a problem, but again, if it loses a load of pressure and the tyre deforms, it's not going to do the tyre any good. So keep the pressure nicely topped up. In fact, you could even put them a bit over pressure at the start of winter and they'll probably be alright again in spring. The other thing with tyre pressures is, if your tyre pressures are really, really low, it makes your bike actually quite heavy to push around. So pump them up, makes your bike easy to wheel around in your workshop. The last race of the season I did on the BMW was very, very wet. So obviously the first thing I did the day after was I stripped the bodywork off a bit and I gave it a thorough clean with a proper bike cleaner like Moto Wash, for example. Really good clean, bit of a polish, and then I did certain things. I took the calipers off, took the pads out, and with some mild detergent, again Moto Wash or something similar, I cleaned the calipers with a toothbrush and then I gave them a dry out with an airline. I've also dried the pads and the discs. Because pads and discs have some ferrous material in them, if you leave them wet, sat side by side for any length of time, they will actually rust together. And then when you move them, there'll be a clonking noise and part of your disc material will be on your pad and vice versa. This can, if it gets really critical, actually knacker up your brake discs. So you don't want to leave wet brakes against a wet disc. Obviously the other alternative, if it's a road bike and you've ridden it in the wet, sat overnight it's probably going to be okay. But ideally the next time it's dry, get out, have a little blast up and down the road, dry your brakes out. I didn't just dry the brakes, I also dried the whole bike as best I could with an airline, and then I had it running so that the heat from the engine getting through the radiators and stuff would get rid of all of the moisture till the fan was cutting in on and off a couple of times to get everything basically as warm as it can get. And then I went round and with some GT85 or similar sort of maintenance spray, some water displacer, went round and sprayed certain bits with water displacer. Nearly forgot the important word there. The places I'm really interested in getting the moisture out of, to be 100% sure, are rose joint pivots. These ones are covered up, but there is mild steel within these. inside the bearings in like the pivot points and stuff in your rear sets and levers and that sort of thing. And really importantly is to get the moisture out of and off the chain, because chains love to rust because there is a lot of mild steel in there. So to get your chain really, really clean, a paddock stand is very useful, or a centre stand if you're very, very sensible, and you get in there with a toothbrush and some mild degreaser or some chain cleaner, give it a good scrub, give it a wash off, and it'll look pretty good. But if you leave it like that, it is of course going to go rusty. So what I use is some GT85 and give it a fairly liberal coasting with GT85, and then dry it off with a rag, and that will also drag any last bits of dirt out of the chain. If your track bike's just going to sit over winter, you can of course just spray it in GT85 or something similar and leave it, because that will get rid of the water. What I've done, I've actually given it a bit of a spray with some Motul chain lube, and the bit I'm really interested in is lubricating the rollers. So I tend to spray down onto the inside of the chain, so I'm squirting down that way, and then it carries it through onto the sprockets and round. That's generally good practice anyway, because if you spray only the top of the roller, when the bike is in motion, the chain lube will be wanting to spread out. If it's on the inside and it wants to spread out, it covers the rest of the roller. Simples. Obviously on your track bike, you don't need to lubricate the outside of the rollers, the actual plates. Now what I have noticed over time is gold chains actually survive better in winter than grey chains, because the plating is slightly different, and this seems a little bit better at fending off the salt and the water. So on the road, again, a bit of a spray with either some chain lube or some GT85 on the sides of the links. That helps preserve the chain, because the number one killer for chains is rust. So we're going to do everything we can to get rid of it. One last comment on chains, if you're riding on the road over winter, is make sure you keep it lubed. The wet and the grit and the salt and all the bits will get into it as you're riding. So the best thing you can do is clean it, lube it, check the tension's good on it, because accelerated chain wear in winter can be a real detriment. That was a big word, wasn't it? Sounded posh though. The next stage of our prep for winter though is to get naked. Not me though, because it's actually not that warm in here, and that would not be an impressive sight. In a race bike you are only allowed water within the cooling system, and the reason for that is the glycol that is in antifreeze is very, very slippery and very difficult to get off a racetrack, and so we just have water, so if there's any spillages, it's not so bad to clean up. There are two main disadvantages to water. The first one is it freezes relatively easily in an English winter. The second problem is it aids corrosion, and so left sat in your engine all winter, things will begin to go furry, and that is not a good thing. So you may have your bike stored in your garage in your workshop with a little bit of a heater on or something in the corner of the workshop, and it's keeping the place away from freezing, and that is excellent. It will keep condensation off stuff and it will keep everything nice, except it won't stop the corrosion inside your engine. For that, antifreeze is ideal. The biggest problem with a bike freezing in winter is that the water inside the engine will go solid, it will expand as it goes solid, and it will actually split the cases. I've seen cylinder heads, barrels, oil coolers, the whole lot being split by being frozen in winter. The corrosion issue is there are lots of little water passages inside your engine. Most of your engine is aluminium, and aluminium will corrode. There are also little bits of steel in there. These BMWs aren't so bad, so it's just a couple of bolts and bits. Some manufacturers have a lot of the pipe work done in steel, and obviously, if it's left just with water in it, it will corrode, and that is not a good thing at all. Another little issue I've seen with a few bikes is core plugs inside the cylinder heads rotting out in winter, and the first time you ride your bike in the summer, they go porous, they push all the water into the oil system in your bike, and that wrecks the whole engine, and we definitely don't want that. What you can do is drain all the water out of the bike. That will stop it freezing, but any water that's left sat in there can still corrode, and because there's more air in the system, it can corrode even faster. So my solution is to put antifreeze in my bike over winter. And the first thing we need to do is take the water out. So every bike will have a drain point to drain the water out of the bike. Interestingly, on the BMs, it's also the bleed point on the pump. but it's above most of the water pump. And so if we drain out of there, we're still going to have water under here. So the fastest way to do it on one of these bikes is take the bottom radiator hose off. I have a washing up bowl because a bucket's quite tall and might not actually fit where you need it under the bike. A washing up bowl is actually a little bit easier. And of course then I can do my washing up. Hose clip off. And these constant pressure hose clips that BMW and quite a lot of the manufacturers are going to are better than Jubilee clips because they keep a constant pressure on the hose, whereas a Jubilee clip can go loose, especially if the pipe, the rubber sort of moves a little bit. So, clip out the way, hold my bucket fairly close, and out comes all my water. Does anybody else need to pee now I've got the sound of running water? Anyone? Anyone out there need a pee? Now's the time. I'll put the adverts in. So now the system is drained, I need to remove my filler cap, my radiator cap, take that out of the way, and I need to put some antifreeze in. Now, I'm sure generic, concentrated, cheapy antifreezes are probably absolutely fine, but I'm going to be using some bike-specific Moto Cool. It's designed to work with all the materials that are in modern engines, aluminium, magnesium, steel, and it won't affect the seals inside the water pump and stuff like that. So, belt and braces, we're using the Moto Cool. I'm going to pour the antifreeze in relatively slowly because as I pour the fluid in, obviously the air that it's expelling will be pushed out, but sometimes that's not a particularly fast process. So, nice and steady, otherwise it's quite common for it to back up in the radiator and actually sort of overflow your antifreeze before you've got all the air out. So it looks like my radiator is full of lovely Moto Cool, but trust me, there is air still in this system that just doesn't want to come out. It is in effect airlocked. Certain bikes have bleed points in certain places. On V-twins it's quite common to have bleed points on the cylinder heads, especially on KTMs, because obviously the cylinder heads can be quite high and they can block the air into there. On the BMWs, and this is quite common on a lot of bikes, this screw here lets the air out of the water pump. And so what I'm going to do, I'm not going to take it all the way out, I'm just going to crack it open a few turns and you'll actually hear the air hissing out, and then once you've got the first couple of drops of antifreeze coming out, just nip the screw back up. I can just hear the air pushing out of there, and so I'll wait a few seconds. There we go, a few little spots of antifreeze coming out, so that means the air has been pushed out the water pump. So, nip that back up, make sure it's well nipped up, because later on we're going to be running the bike and we don't want it forcing water back out from behind the copper washer. Very specific point for bleeding things up. If you have a new shaped fire blade, firstly congratulations, you've got a great bike. Secondly, there are bleed points actually in the cylinders, in the barrels, in the top of them, so you need to take them off, and when you take them off you will need to put another litre of water in the radiator to get the air to push out the cylinders. So that is definitely worth knowing if you've got a new fire blade. So I can't see any antifreeze in the top of my radiator, so it will have gone down a reasonable amount as it pushed the air out of the water pump. But I'm sure there is going to be more air in the system yet, so we're going to have to get that out as well after I've topped this up. Pretty much every bike manufacturer puts the radiator filler on the right hand side of the bike, and there is of course a good reason for that. The system is designed to basically bleed its own air out when it's leant over to the left, which is of course where the side stand is. So to make my life easier, I have refitted my side stand. The other advantage of this is, the whole of winter while I'm moving the bike around, I've got a side stand. And side stands are just brilliant. They're so much easier than paddock stands, until you need to take your wheels in and out. The angle of the bike has definitely helped push some of the air bubbles out and up into the radiator and then out the top. So I've kept topping the radiator up, and a couple of times I have actually taken the bike off its side stand and leant it over basically as far as I could, and that's just got a little bit more out. The next thing to do is to get the bike fired up, because once the water pump is running, it will push a little bit more out of a couple of places. Any like last little bits that are of air that are trapped in the bike, it will push them out. So I am actually leaving the radiator cap off. If I come down here, make sure bike's in neutral. So just a few seconds there, and we can see we've lost a load more antifreeze into the radiator. So I'm going to do that a couple of times to top up, and then we'll be pretty good. So having gone through that process a couple of times, it's no longer gulping any more antifreeze down, so I'm happy that we've got pretty much all the air out of the system. So, radiator cap on and tight. There's a little bit of antifreeze in the overflow bottle, and what I'm going to do now is just run the bike up to temperature, and I want it hot enough so the thermostat is open, so the whole system is circulating nicely, get a load of temperature in it, and because this bike's still got the fan on it, I'm just going to let it come on and off the fan a couple of times to get as much heat through the cooling system and the oil as I can. If you're going to run your bike over winter, try and run it for as long as you can. Get the fan blowing, or even get a fan blowing onto it, so that you can get plenty of temperature, not just in the water but into the oil. Because of the damp in the air over winter, if you're not careful, you'll get a load of condensation in the engine cases. You run your bike for 30 seconds, you'll turn it off, and that condensation will actually start corroding some of the bits inside the motor. So ideally, you want to never run it at all over winter, or if you are going to run it so it gets really, really hot. So that is my top tip. After there's a bit of temperature in the bike, I like to hold the throttle open a little bit, get some real temperature into the motor, and that again will help get rid of the condensation. Toasty! Another tip for the racers out there: if you own your own transponder, make sure at some point over winter or every couple of months, stick it on charge and top it up, because the batteries in these, when they wear out, if they go really, really flat and they die, they are a pig to change. So make your life easy. If you want your transponder to work next year, charge up every couple of months. The next thing we need to talk about is petrol, or in fact the ethanol that's in petrol, because ethanol is hygroscopic, and over winter, as the temperature goes up and down in your garage or your workshop, the tank will breathe slightly, and every time it breathes in, it will bring in damp air, and because the ethanol in your petrol is hygroscopic, eventually you end up with water in your petrol tank, and then your fuel tank goes rusty, unless you have a BMW because they've got an aluminium fuel tank, and a rusty fuel tank is no good to anybody because it's a right faff to sort out. The fuel will also go off over winter, and so ideally you want to either have the tank completely empty and run dry, or absolutely brimful so that there's no air gap, so that you can't basically breathe any air into it to then turn into water. Most super unleadeds have less ethanol in them than normal regular petrol. Basically regular petrol is E10, so it's got 10% ethanol, sometimes a little bit more. Most super unleadeds have 5% ethanol. Some of the Esso stations, have 0 ethanol in their fuel. If you want to go really fancy, you can get stuff called Aspen, which is, the classic boys love it, about 25 quid a gallon, but is completely ethanol free, and it basically doesn't go off. Another option is a fuel stabiliser. So basically this stops the fuel absorbing the water as easily, and it means the fuel will still be decent enough in spring, so your bike will actually start. My preference is to have the tank drained and the bike stored somewhere that's as dry as possible. And as we've already commented on, you don't need to run your bike over winter. The engine will be fine, just sat there with its antifreeze in for the next few months. If you want to, you can also disconnect the battery so that it doesn't deplete over winter. If it's a lead acid battery, you can put it somewhere nice and warm. If it's a lithium battery, they actually like the cold, so you can leave it somewhere nice and cool, literally just disconnect it from the bike, and it should hold its charge. Probably. Unless it's anywhere near a Ducati, and then it probably won't. Winter tends to drag on a little bit, and because you now have a few months without riding your motorcycle, it would be an ideal time to get some of your maintenance done, especially your suspension serviced. Nobody likes getting their bike out the night before a track day and finding their fork seals leaking or their shock's gone soft. So this is an ideal time to take your suspension out your bike and send it to me to get it serviced. We can service Bitubo, K-Tech, most Olin shocks, most road bike shocks, pretty much every fork out there, you name it, pretty much everything we can do. And if you've watched this video and decided you actually want to have a proper dedicated track bike, give us a shout, we can build that for you as well. Couple of other little mentions. Modern bearings are very, very good, but they're not brilliant at staying in the same place all the time. So what I like to do every few weeks is just go to where I store the bikes, give the steering a little bit of a wiggle, push up and down on the forks, push up and down on the back of the bike, and ideally move the bike around a little bit so the wheel bearings, when you sit it back in its corner, will be in a slightly different position. All these little things just help the longevity of your seals and your bearings. And that's about it for my winter prep on the BMW. I've let it cool down, I've checked the water level in it, everything is happy, so I've popped the bodyweight back on and it is ready to go into storage. If you're a road rider and you want to keep riding through winter, that's great. If you want even more confidence in the conditions, check out rapidtraining.co.uk because there's currently a bit of an offer on if you book your training course over winter. Thanks for watching, I hope this has been really useful and join me again soon for some more motorbike fun.